Hi, everyone, and welcome to episode 10 of The Followers. Uh, Today, we're moving on to our. It's episode 10, isn't it? It is, yeah, it is. It is episode 10. Time flies. Time flies when you're having fun, man. So, today, we're going to speak a little bit on carbohydrates, the talk about some of the, I suppose, big questions that come up around carbohydrate inclusion in our diet, the role it plays, what carbohydrates are, and I suppose most importantly, how Shane did actually achieve the title of the Oat King and why that's so important to him. But we'll touch on some of the more serious stuff first. So if we want to jump off, Shane, do you want to give a little bit of a background on carbohydrates from a calorie perspective or what they are or anything like that?
Yeah, I suppose the main thing when we're talking about carbohydrates off the bat is it's been given kind of a bad name. We've touched on this briefly before, but like at the moment, the food industry is quite cyclical. Like they'll go through different things. So 5, 10 years ago, everything was low fat because fat was what was the next bad thing and making you gain so much weight. Now it's carbs. I don't know what the next thing will be, but it'll go through cycles and it keeps running through things like that. So at the moment, carbs are kind of the enemy as it goes for food marketing, but it's really not the case at all. So carbohydrates, just like protein, are going to be 4 calories per gram, and carbohydrates, their main focus in the body is going to be they're the body's easiest way to get energy. So if the body's looking for energy, the most efficient way for the body to get energy is going to be through burning carbohydrates. So when carbohydrates are eaten in the body, they're going to be processed and broken down into glucose. So that's going to be the simplest form of carbohydrate, and that's what your body is going to use then for energy. So your body can either use that glucose for energy straight away, or it can be stored in the body in the liver and the muscles as something called glycogen, and that glycogen acts as like an energy reserve, so almost like petrol in the tank, that if you don't have enough carbohydrates through eating, say if you're on the pitch for example, that's when you kick into that glycogen and start using that for energy. So energy is always really going to be the main focus for carbohydrates. So I suppose where the bad name from carbohydrates is coming from is if you don't have that energy build, so people think or people say that if you don't have that energy reserve, you're not eating carbohydrates for energy, your body will go and start burning body fat for energy as well. But it's not that simple. So again, as we said there, carbohydrates are the most efficient way for the body to use for energy. So anything else or anything other than that most efficient way is going to be either more time consuming for the body, more resource consuming, or not as efficient. So again, if you don't have carbohydrates, you're going to be sacrificing something else in the body to come through. Would that be fair to say, guys?
Yeah, it would. And actually, just the only thing that I'd like to add on top of that is that often, for me anyway, that the conversation around carbohydrate tends to be focused a little bit on exercise and like performance or training or something like that. But what's often kind of forgotten about is that glucose is the main energy source for our brains, and like our brain can use anywhere around 120 grams of carbohydrate in a day, which is almost 400 calories of carbohydrate. So eating a very low carbohydrate diet, or not including carbohydrate in your diet, you're like you said there, Shane, like it's going to have to. Our bodies are going to have to create or find glucose in another manner. So it will use some of our protein intake to create that glucose to fuel our brain. So that's something that people who may suffer a little bit from fatigue, or it can bring about fatigue, low carbohydrate intakes, or low carbohydrate diets, just mental fatigue, mental fog. Irritability is another thing. Kind of a poor stress management can also come with it, as well as in some people, it can affect the release of serotonin in our brains, which is our feel good hormone as well. So that's just a little bit of an addition to the kind of exercise and performance side of things there.
Yeah, that's a good point you make there about the brain requiring a certain amount of carbohydrate for fuel. Now, Shane mentioned there that the liver and muscles can store carbohydrate for use later on, whereas the brain doesn't really have that capacity. It needs that reasonably constant supply. Now, because it doesn't use as much as the majority of muscles and liver will use, it's not going to require the same constant supply. But like when we said before, that protein needs to be reasonably evenly spaced, evenly spaced throughout the day. There does need to be some element of carbohydrate for that, but it's not a case of like you need massive amounts, because like, while the brain uses some energy, it's not near as much as the rest of the body. It's not like 4 slices of toast at breakfast just so you can, plot your drive to work or whatever like that. It's not to that extent. Yeah, that's just the main thing then to think about for the brain. Also, when Shane said there about storage, that while your muscles and liver can hold a certain amount of fuel, if you're not using it, so if you are eating quite a carbohydrate diet and you may have a rest day or you're just largely inactive, it will then start turning into fat. So that's possibly where people do get the idea that the carbohydrate is bad. It leads to more fat. It's once everything is full and you're not being particularly active, that's when it starts being converted into triglyceride. And I suppose once it's converted into fat, then it's not as readily available, and it's also going to fuel more low intensity activity as opposed to high intensity activity. So say, just trying to think of an analogy there. If I had a job for Damien and I rang him up and said, Damien, I need you to do this job for me. Let's say, throw it back to when I used to be a carpenter. I need Damien to come labour with me for the day. So I said, be there at 8 o'clock in the morning. So Damien turns up at 8, bussing for work. He's had his big carbohydrate feed for breakfast. He's ready to go. He's going to carry timber around for me all day. And I don't turn up till, I don't know, 10, 11, 12 o'clock. Damien is sitting around, and he's that bit of carbohydrate there waiting. He's buzzing for work. Then once that bit of time comes by and it's not ready to be used, he's then been converted into fat. He's kind of lost interest in the real intense work he wants to do. He's now just going to be sluggish and slow and just not that eager to really work hard for today. That's what happens when the carbohydrate is not used straight away, turns into fat, and is then more suitable for much lower intensity physical activity. I think that tries to explain it in some form.
I feel very called out there.
John showing up late, Damo being lazy, it's college all over again.
Guilty.
Just before, when we talked about protein, we said the way there was different amino acids and some different proteins are made up differently. How does that work then in carbohydrate? There's mention of simple or complex carbohydrates, or even low GI or high GI. What do either of those mean?
So I suppose it's not the same as with protein. Different amino acids have different roles within the body, whereas with carbohydrates, the structure mainly focuses on how quick the body can break that down and convert it into glucose to be used for energy. So quite simple carbohydrates would be things like sugars, sweets, jellies, things like that. Stuff that you'd get, kind of that kids are addicted to, or that you'd get just before a match, that will give you this really, really quick burst of energy, but not for a very long time. So again, it's going to be a quick burst of energy, you're going to have a big high, and then it's going to be followed by a massive low or a slump. Whereas the more complex carbohydrates, so things like whole grains, things like potatoes, it's going to be much slower for the body to break them down. So almost the GI scale that you mentioned there is almost a scale of how quickly the body can break down food to be used for energy. So those lower scores on the GI track are going to be much slower and a much slower release of energy. So it's more of a gradual increase in glucose. So you have a steady stream of glucose coming into the body for maybe 2-3 hours, as opposed to just a big influx straight away. So you get energy, and then completely fall off. Whereas with a slower release energy, it's going to be much, much steadier pace. So again, as you said, this will be much better for kind of brain activity. So if you say, it's usually what we'd advise for people who are studying or people going to school. So a nice whole grain breakfast means that you have that steady release of energy. So it's constantly fueling your brain. Whereas if you have something like a super sugary cereal in the morning, you'll kind of go in buzzing and you'll have loads of energy, but then by 9:30, 10 o'clock, you've kind of lost your attention span already. John, I'm sure you've seen this before in school.
Yeah, a lot of, you can hear bellies grumbling, and there's not much attention being paid to what you're saying. This year we even changed our break from 20 past 10 to 11 o'clock, and halfway through that 10 to 11 class, there's not much attention being paid to anything. It's worth as well mention that while a lot of attention is given to low GI and high GI foods, that you want to eat more high GI because it's slower to digest, that makes perfect sense if you only ate carbohydrates in isolation. But the fact carbohydrate usually makes up some part of a larger meal. That's also going to make a big difference to the speed that it's digested at. Like at the top of the GI the GI table continuum, whatever, is like raw glucose. So if you're at raw glucose, that'd be, I don't know how you'd even manage that, but that would be digested really, really quickly. Whereas at the other end, then I think peanuts are really low on it. Now, I suppose it's fat that's slowing that down, but that's quite slow to digest. Whereas white rice is reasonably quick to digest. But if you're eating rice with chicken, or if you're eating spuds with steak, the protein, amino acids, or any fat that's in there is going to slow that down quite a lot as well. So in general, for slow digestion, it's better to eat higher up along that GI continuum. But realistically, if you're eating it along with other foods that contain protein and fat, it's going to have like much slower digestion there anyway.
Yeah, that's kind of why, from a performance point of view, when we're dealing with athletes, either in the build up to a game, kind of if they have, maybe if it's a midday kickoff or they have kind of 2 or 3 hours where they can eat a breakfast, it's usually we'll tell them to have nearly entirely carbohydrate based foods, because it means you don't have any other factors affecting it. And it means if we have high GI foods in that, it's going to be a high GI response, as opposed to, again, like you said, if you're mixing it in with lots of chicken, different fats, you're going to slow everything down. It's kind of harder to predict from a performance and energy point of view.
So what kind of decides the high and low GI is often like the makeup of the carbohydrate itself, whether it's simple or complex. So just Damien, will you give us a quick little overview there on what is simple, what's complex, and what leads to that?
Well, I sorry. So, like as you're saying, like carbohydrates are um, chains of glucose or sugar units. Some carbohydrate in food would be made up of your short chains of sugar units, and that they're recognized as your simple carbohydrates, as we're talking about there, often, or kind of more confectionery foods, maybe your jellies, your chocolates, your jams, these type of things, soft drinks, and then your complex carbohydrates are made up of long, kind of more complicated chains of of sugars. Kind of looked upon as like your starches, your whole grain breads, potatoes, your brown rice, pasta, these type of things. Um, so yeah, like that's kind of what we're looking at. And I suppose from a day to day living perspective, what you're looking to do in, I suppose, meal patterns and stuff is something we'll chat about and at another probably at another time. But regular intake of your complex carbohydrates, at regular intervals throughout your day. So even if you're kind of like a breakfast, lunch, and dinner, where you've included, I suppose, a good portion, or a decent portion of your complex carbohydrates there, that it just allows you that steady release and steady stream of energy across a number of hours, and then you're looking to kind of pick that up again. So if you go from breakfast to lunch, you've given yourself a steady, consistent source of energy for those few hours. Repeat it again at lunchtime, and you give yourself another steady stream of energy for your afternoon. And again with dinner, then you're kind of trying to pull down or pull back a little bit, possibly depending on whether or not you've a sporting activity or something like that in the evening, will obviously all influence that. But you're just looking to provide yourself with another steady stream of energy, to get you through your evening and night. This because your complex carbohydrates, with their slow release of energy, there's much slower to break down and be absorbed into our blood, so they don't spike our blood sugars as much, which is something to be aware of. And kind of if you've any issues there around blood sugars, whereas our simple carbohydrates, like your sweets, your jams, your confectionery type foods, or soft drinks, your normal kind of soft drinks anyway, that these do spike our blood sugar levels quite quickly and quite high, which kind of comes back again to our, when we're talking about our low GI and high GI foods, and how they interact in our body, and just the blood sugar levels that they bring about as a result of consumption. So when I suppose often you come across people suggesting to eliminate foods and that. But realistically, when you go about eliminating different foods, and it is very often a conversation solely around carbohydrate kind of grouped foods, but you're really trying to limit these type of things, and often in dieting and in people trying to manage or in weight management, I should say, people eliminate things that, as I've mentioned there, like your jellies, your chocolate, your jams. These are all very sweet. They're very enjoyable. We tend to enjoy eating them. We get a lot of satisfaction from a taste perspective from eating them. So elimination really isn't is kind of a stumbling block that it's a mistake that a lot of people tend to make with these. Whereas limiting and like including them in your diet across a day or week or whatever, there is a place for them. It's just it just takes a little bit of management, a little bit of focus when it comes to weight management, and I suppose management of those of spiking of blood sugars. So often what I do suggest with those type of foods, with your simple sugars, is that you keep them closer to maybe a bout of exercise, or you keep them for a particular point in your day, where a bit of a spike up in sugar is something you could do with, or that you could put to some use. But you're realistically, like your goal really is to just maintain a kind of a constant energy source, a constant flow of energy from that you do get from including your complex carbohydrates, as I said, like your oats, your oats, your whole grain breads, cereals, or like your whole grain, like rices, your brown rices or pastas, these type of things. That a steady inclusion of them across your day, it allows you to stay very consistent with your energy levels as you get through the day. Whereas I do find that it's an area where people either kind of exclude from parts of their day, or kind of and then find themselves not being able to maybe steady the ship when it comes to consistent levels of energy throughout their day. Again, like normal, Murph, I've started talking and I've no idea if I actually answered your question, but sure, look, our listeners have come to expect that from me.
You answered someone's question.
I answered someone's question.
Yeah, so you talked a bit about sugar there and blood sugar level spikes. So that like sugar in really has been demonized over the past while. So just Shane, like sugar in and of itself, is it bad? Is it not bad? What are some of the misconceptions people have around that, and how can we maybe go some ways towards addressing the management of sugar in our lives if that's necessary?
Yeah, so it kind of, sugar itself nearly ties back into what we were talking about earlier. So it's almost pure glucose. So it's very condensed. So while all carbohydrates are going to be 4 calories per gram, sugar is quite dense. There's going to be a lot of calories in those smaller molecules. So it's very easy to rack up 200-300 calories with a couple of spoons of sugar. Whereas opposed to if you were trying to get that through potatoes or sweet potatoes or something like that, you get a lot more volume of food. So it's hyper palatable sugar, and it's also not very nutritionally rich if we're talking about nutrients outside of carbohydrates. So it's almost solely carbohydrate. It would have a very low micronutritional value, as opposed to something like, again, like a whole grain, like a potato, something like that, where you're going to get a lot of fiber, you're going to get a lot of different micronutrients. So sugar is just very easy to eat in larger quantities, and it's also a lot of sugar that people will be getting in will be through things like soft drinks, where they don't really realize how much sugar is in it, and it's just not necessary. So again, it's demonized on a grand scale, so all sugar is demonized when it should be just super sugary condensed sugar things. So again, Coke is going to have probably the same amount of sugar than if you had 7 cups of tea throughout the day with a spoonful of sugar in each. So it's just you're getting 2-3 times your daily allowance of sugar in these smaller condensed spaces. So that's really where the demonization of sugar come from, is just it's so highly palatable, and it's overconsumed, which means people are overconsuming their carbohydrates but without really realizing it. So someone could easily go over their daily macro goal of carbohydrates just through Coke. Like I've worked with clients before who would have 4, 5, 6 bottles of Coke a day and not really realize there's calories in it, but definitely not realize how much calories are in it. So that's kind of why sugar is demonized. So again, it has its positives. I see why people are trying to demonize sugar, why the government has gone down that route. I just don't think it's been executed very well. I don't know if you guys would agree.
No, I'd agree completely there that like sugar in and of itself isn't bad. That like if we're decide like healthy and unhealthy isn't a black and white. It's a continuum, and even if it is that, because it has to be dependent on a context like that. Just for it's a fairly out there example, but I've heard of MMA fighters or boxers or powerlifters making weight for a competition. And because they weigh in and 2 hours later they have to go and compete, the only way they can get in enough calories to be even remotely healthy again for what's about to happen is to drink soft drinks like Coke, 7 Up, whatever like that, just to consume calories. And that's bringing them from quite an unhealthy state, dehydrated, very low on fuel, very glycogen depleted. The only way they can get that back in is through the liquid calories, through sugar, which is very high in calories, is quite palatable, and will also hydrate them. So that's taking them from unhealthy to healthy. That's probably drinking nearly 2 liters of Coke. There's very, very, very few other situations in life where you're going to drink 2 liters of Coke or any other soft drink that's known as healthy. So it's worth remembering that it is context dependent, and that used in the right situations, such as that, sugar can be very useful. It's just because so many people's lifestyles now are very low in activity and quite sedentary, that consuming something that high in calories, hyper palatable, that's easy to consume quite a lot of it. That's why sugar has become largely demonized. It's not the impact of sugar on its own that leads to the various lifestyle related health issues such as diabetes, obesity, hypertension, cardiovascular disease, all like that. It's just because it leads to people over consuming and putting on that excess weight that then leads to the type 2 diabetes and stuff like that.
I'd also like to just add in on that, Murph, actually, when it comes to just overconsumption as well. And it can be a little bit more, I suppose, your Western diet, where even with your complex carbohydrates there, that like serving sizes that people are used to are much, much larger than what portion size is actually required for the person. So while we might look at it in a sporting sense, quite, if for certain sports, certain glycolytic based sports, like cycling or field sports or anything like that, that might require quite a lot of carbohydrate. Often, when you look at your day to day person who might live a kind of an otherwise sedentary lifestyle, that their portion sizes of things that even they that right from a food intake perspective, or food decision perspective, they might be like, yeah, that's decent quality. There's good fiber in there. There's good micronutrients going, but often that the portion sizes are huge, and this is especially an issue when it comes to things like, and I'm not trying to demonize them because they're fantastic, but eating bread can often be some. I've seen people sit down and eat loaves of bread with a jar of jam. It's impressive, but not necessary. Things like bowls of pasta, rice, portion sizes, that people don't necessarily. I've come across, and this is based off my experience with clients and athletes I've worked with, that they're often it's a portion size issue. So we can look at the simple carbohydrates, or like our sugars, or things that are considered to be sugars, or sugary options, and kind of focus on them. But with that's kind of missing the wood from the trees a little bit for a lot of people, because like it is quite common that those serving sizes, and often it can be the size of the bowl or size of the plate, and we're trying to fill it up, and then sure we can't leave anything behind, and people just over intake. So and that might be a little bit of an Irish thing, but it's very common, just with when it comes to portion sizes as well. So that's just the only addition that I had to that.
No, I think that's a really good point. And like, I'm not going to go all like blind by esque on like looking at the sociology behind it all.
Well, that's him gone anyway.
But if you think back, like Ireland was traditionally a farm-based labour, people outside working a lot, so we had to consume quite a bit to cope with all those demands. Like if I think back to my grandfather, he was a builder and a farmer. He worked both, so he came in every evening, had a big pot of spuds for his dinner. And if you even think to someone who is a farmer now, they actually spend quite a lot of their day sitting on a tractor. So if they were to model the same diet that a farmer 30, 40 years ago had, even that same job now, the actual calorie demands of that have gone way down. But it's almost like, oh, you're a good man now, you're out working hard, you come in, you eat a pile of spuds for your dinner. If you're to follow that same lifestyle or methodology or whatever, your size is going to increase a lot, and it's going to be largely fat based just because your calorie output isn't the same. Plus the whole, like, it's very rude to leave food on your plate if someone prepared it for you. So that also leads to the overconsumption of calories and stuff. And say, oh, it would be nice if I made something sweet for these people coming to visit my house, because it's, oh sure, it's nice to make sweets, and then it's rude for them not to eat it, and that's why it also leads to the overconsumption
Mhm.
of calories, predominantly carbohydrate and sugar.
Mhm.
I think there's also, with it being kind of, sorry, it's just a small bit there again, of being hyper palatable. I think a lot of people almost confuse things that are kind of hyper sugary for a healthy alternative. So a lot of the time, say people see athletes before a game with something like Lucozade Sport, and they'll assume, oh, Lucozade Sport must be a healthy drink, so I'll buy that. But they buy it in the shop then going to school rather than just before a game. And similarly with things like, if people choose the salad, they'll be like, oh, I'll go with salad, I'll be healthy, and then just don't realize there can be so much sugar and so much carbohydrate in different dressings that it's kind of almost the little add-ons that go under the radar that people wouldn't necessarily track or consider being their calories. That's where a lot of the damage is done, and that's where sugar plays a huge role, because again, it can rack up so quickly, and since it dissolves in water quite, it's very unsusceptible to the eye, because it doesn't look like a huge amount of calories, it doesn't look like a huge amount of food. It's easy to kind of slip under the radar, and then people don't realize why they're gaining weight, or don't see, or wondering why they don't see the results they think they should.
Yeah, that can really bring a lot of confusion, and that there is a lot of confusion when it comes to carbohydrate. And I think you've nailed one big one there. When people, you often hear or I often hear it anyway, the McDonald's salad, having more calories than one of the burgers or whatever. Like, I heard it only this week on one of the main radio stations, and the presenter was still like, he was like, I just don't get it. I just don't, how, like, I thought I was being healthy, and I was like, is this still going on? But it is still a big area of confusion. And it is worth remembering those things that do get looked over, or overlooked. And if you do, I suppose one of the things I do advise people to look for when they are getting sauces, or if they're getting anything with a sauce, just to give a practical takeaway, I suppose, is to uh, ask for these things on the side. If you're getting, an eggs Benedict, and you're not sure, what's going into it, or what kind of calories are going into it. Obviously, I'm dealing more fat there than, but just get sauces on the side if you can, and then you can use them a little bit more sparingly. If you're buying sauces for at home, if you're not making them yourself, if you're buying them, then look for the lower calorie options. There's plenty of them out there. I know, Murphy, you regularly have low calorie options for sauces up on your Instagram, that it just like, and they're just as tasty. That, and that there's it's something again, it's just another little area that gets overlooked, and people will then go down the route of demonizing food, and in different senses, and again, just slightly missing the actual, um what's actually, where there actually might be a mistake happening, or a slip up happening.
Yeah, really good point. I even noticed in just back in school this week, and one of the other teachers said, "Oh, I'll go get something healthy now for my lunch. I'll go up to Tesco and I'll get a salad," and came back with like a plastic carton of potato salad and coleslaw. And I was thinking, what's your idea of health? That's just laden with calories. Just a question you mentioned before we started recording there, Damien, was, are carbohydrates essential to the diet? Do we have to have them or not? Um, let's just explore that a bit there now. Since you asked the question, I'll let you lead it off.
I need to learn to shut up. So, okay, it is, it is an area of conversation, certainly, as to whether or not carbohydrate is an essential nutrient. Obviously, essential meaning that we need them in our diet. If you remember back to the beginning of this, Shane spoke about how, if we don't have enough carbohydrate in our diet, that our body will then take protein to and break that down into glucose. So it's not really making a full use of our protein intake as much as in the areas that we would necessarily want it. So too low of a carbohydrate intake, our body is going to, like as we mentioned with our brain, requiring a constant flow of glucose as its energy source. It's going to have to, create glucose from somewhere. So so it will take protein and break it down, and use that to fuel our brain, if there isn't a store there for us, or if there isn't a regular intake of carbohydrate for us. So is carbohydrate essential? No, not on a very technical level. It's not essential. However, that doesn't necessarily allow us to be optimal in our use of our other macronutrients, like protein, which is so important and often under eaten in the general public. So while we might be very focused on the sporting group or groups around, or training groups, or people who exercise in the gym and stuff like that, and consider them to be on maybe high protein diets like we discussed last week, the general public and the general population tend to traditionally consume a low protein diet. So if they're also not consuming a carbohydrate, if they're consuming a very low carbohydrate in addition to this, then they really are going to be as they're not going to be anywhere near optimal for energy, for fueling their brain, to keep them to allow them the ability to to stay focused and alert, and to create that neural pathway for tryptophan into our brain to create serotonin, these type of things. So including carbohydrate in your diet, and I know I've literally just said technically it's not essential. I would be more of on the side of the fence of saying that regular intake of carbohydrate as part of your day-to-day routine and pattern is essential for providing your body with an optimal energy source, a very readily available energy source, and it allows you to make sure that you're using, you're not having to break down protein to achieve or to have glucose present in your system.
Yeah, no, I think you answered that quite well. And again, to give another analogy, is electricity essential to get through life okay? No, it's not. Does it make things an awful lot easier? And does it provide an awful lot of benefits to daily life? Most definitely. Can you become over-reliant on carbohydrate in the diet, just like you can become over-reliant on electricity and technology in your life and lead to negatives? Yes, of course. Just because, okay, carbohydrate technically is not essential. Shane, what are some of the things that carbohydrate makes it so much easier? Particularly some of the micronutrients we can get through or with carbohydrate that are very beneficial to us.
Yeah, I suppose we kind of touched on it earlier that you're not going to get a lot of foods that are going to be primarily carbohydrate and carbohydrate alone. So if you take things that are going to be kind of the most used or most eaten kind of carbohydrates, are going to be, especially in Ireland, things like potatoes, things like rice, probably things like pasta, bread, maybe they'd be, I'd say top four anyway. Might be forgetting a couple of things. But again, they're going to provide the body with so many different micronutrients, so many vitamins, so many minerals, and it's also going to really increase your fiber intake. Again, sorry, as well as that, it's going to be vegetables as well. So vegetables are going to have a carbohydrate source, and again, that's where people are going to get most, if not all, of their vitamins and minerals. So while carbohydrates, we've looked at kind of the bad side with things like sugar, where it's just a highly palatable, usually highly calorific food source that's overeaten. The other side of that is carbohydrates have very low carb options that are so much more rich in micronutrients. Like things like vegetables are that everyone should have more in their diet. So every dietitian, every nutritionist you talk to will probably say you can increase your vegetable intake, which you should. But that's not linked to people. Like if you went to a nutritionist and they just said you have to increase your carbohydrate intake, you'd be like, what, this guy must be mad, like he didn't really look at anything. Whereas if you say increase your vegetable intake, that's in a way the same thing, but nobody really sees it that way. So nobody sees carbohydrates including fruits and vegetables. there's almost, people nearly see it as four different food groups. So there's fats, proteins, carbohydrates, and then fruits and vegetables. But they are a carbohydrate. And again, it's something that everybody should be including. So Damien said there, it's not essential to have carbohydrates in your diet. But if you don't have carbohydrates in your diet, so if you don't eat fruits and vegetables, it's going to be very hard to get those micronutrients in. And it's going to be very hard to hit all of your micronutrient targets without supplementation. So again, that's it. Just because technically you don't need something doesn't mean you shouldn't.
Yeah, really good point there on the veg, that just eating veg of itself, say, oh, I want to be healthier, I want to get a six pack. If I start eating more veg, will that automatically just turn this straight line I have as a stomach into a six pack? No, it won't. It's, in fairness to dietitians and nutritionists, it's leaning on or linking to that behavioral aspect, that by eating more fruit and vegetable, you start, for starters, automatically taking in more fiber, which does lead to improved health. It brings in all the minerals and vitamins, because there is some element of planning to getting in more fruit and veg. You probably have to buy it yourself, or at least go to some effort to prepare it in advance. It also takes up more space in your stomach, so it just fills you more, which is essentially the opposite of sugar, which, because it can take up such little space in your stomach, it makes it easier to overconsume. So if we eat more fruit and veg, it actually makes it harder to eat unhealthy in a way. And that's why eat more fruit and veg tends to be one of the linked to so many health outcomes across the various populations. Anything else to wrap up on then with carbohydrates, or are we happy enough to have addressed a lot of the topics there?
I think we've spoken about quite a bit of it, but do we want to maybe want to mention something on fiber? We've mentioned it a few times. It's an area that does get kind of, it's a word that gets pushed out quite a lot, but people don't necessarily understand the importance of it, or why we need to, why we need to keep it in our diet. Murph, would you have anything that you'd speak about with any of the athletes, or anything that you'd work with, if they had any questions around fiber?
For athletes, the two things I'd say is make sure you're getting enough. Try get it through fruit and veg. Aim for whole grain options of your carbohydrates, so brown bread instead of normal bread. I think in rice, it's not a major impact whether you go brown or white. They tend to be quite close in terms of fiber and just overall digestion there. Spuds are a great source of fiber, but I will encourage them to keep fiber away from performance, whether it be training or a match. I'll usually say, okay, you can go, if it's the GI continuum you're using, go a little bit lower there, or maybe pull some of the fiber out. I'll kind of, relate that to fat, which we'll talk about the next day. They'll be the main things. The main benefits of fiber are predominantly around digestion, which I think at some stage it's worth doing a full episode on kind of gut health and digestion anyway, particularly some of the myths around and all that. But that's kind of the main thing I'm looking at in fiber.
For me, it's just, you look, you've the two types. You've your soluble or insoluble fiber. That are the two terms used to describe fiber in our diet. I suppose whether they're really appropriate or not, there's questions around that. But I suppose it's important from a gut health perspective, from just obviously including in your diet. That basically we can't really break fiber down too much, and it's just it's there to help digestion in the small intestine. Or sorry, it's not digestion in the small intestine, and it helps. It helps for passage of food down through our gut, and down through our large intestine. So what's I suppose other than that, you mentioned, the sources of it, your whole grain, your whole grain breads, pastas, and stuff like that, your oats, vegetables like broccoli, carrots, and that, potatoes with the skin on, these type of things, peas and beans, and pulses and stuff like that are all high fiber as well. So it's just an inclusion of a variety of those in your diet, really just to ensure that you are getting sufficient levels of fiber into your diet. But it's massive from a digestive perspective.
It's also a good almost kind of benchmark for if you're worried about your carbohydrate intake or kind of quality of carbohydrate intake. Most carbohydrates that have a medium to relatively high fiber content are going to be a good source. So it's going to be fruits and vegetables. It's going to be whole grains. So if you follow things that have a fiber content, you're not going to go too far wrong with your carbohydrate intake. And it's also going to be very tough to overeat on those. You're really going to have to go out of your way or put effort into overeat with just those carbohydrate sources. So again, it's a good kind of barometer, I suppose, to kind of measure your carbohydrate intake on. It's easy enough to control portion sizes that way.
Yeah, that's all good then. I think that wraps us up for today. The next episode, we'll start looking at fat. We also have a few guests, both exciting and interesting, lined up over the next few weeks. If you have any questions, leave it under the video here if you're watching on YouTube. Hit any of us up on social media at neither. And please tell your friends, or even if you don't have any friends, just people you know are in contact with about this. Thanks, everyone.